Welcome to the 8th Annual March of Remembrance program to support the Jewish Community Relations Council's Esther Raab Holocaust Museum and Goodwin Education Center. I am Carol Orwitz, a co-chair of the March of Remembrance Committee, along with Allison Snyder. We are so pleased to have you here for tonight's program. To our many sponsors and donors, we are deeply grateful for your generosity, especially this year when we could not gather in person. Your donations support our mission to teach people about the past and to educate them for the future through the painful lessons of the Holocaust. Our objective is to reduce prejudice and lessen hatred, bigotry, bullying, and violence against all groups. Specifically, your donations allow us to continue offering a wide variety of programs to thousands of students, educators, and community members. Every year we offer survivor, second and third generation speakers, theatrical productions, guest readers to elementary schools, teacher training, and community Yom HaShoah, Kristallnacht, and International Holocaust Remembrance Day observances. We have been able to provide virtual programs since last March, and now, thanks to your generous support, we'll be able to continue doing so through this academic year. Thank you to our dedicated and creative March of Remembrance committee members this year who worked hard to bring this program to fruition. A special thank you to our director, Helen and Israel and Holocaust Education Fellow and unofficial technology wizard, Aaron Sauer, without whom none of this would happen. Finally, thank you to our precious community survivors. You deeply inspire all of us to make this a better world. Enjoy the program.
My name is Doug Servey. I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education, and on behalf of the New Jersey Commission, I would like to welcome all of you to the Raab Goodwin Museum and Holocaust Education Center that is one of 30 centers throughout the state of New Jersey. This center is one of the leaders in Holocaust and genocide education in our state. It is an honor to be able to speak with you today for the 8th Annual March of Remembrance, which is such an important topic in the current times that we presently live. I would like to thank all of you for participating in the New Jersey Week of Respect by marching again against hate, bigotry, and hate in our communities. We almost always try to make this a better world for not only our people, but anybody of any background. I would also like to welcome Dr. Stephen Smith from the Shoah Foundation to have him show and explain the important work that the Shoah Foundation has been doing in California and the United States. We owe this to the victims and the survivors of the Shoah to make sure that this never happens again.
My name is Charles Middleberg, and I am a Holocaust survivor. I am a member of the Raab Goodwin Holocaust and Education Center. For more than 25 years, I have been going to schools, to any area that requests for me to come and talk about my experiences as a Holocaust survivor. When I'm finished talking, I find that most of the people that I spoke with tell me that they've learned more from me than whatever movie or book they've ever read about this horrible time. I think it is very important that we keep talking about the experiences of the Holocaust. And the March of Remembrance is not only for the memory of those who perished, but it also to remember those who contributed to the survival, like my younger brother and me. We must remember all the time the horrors that prejudice and hatred can create in its worst form.
Good evening. My name is Helen Kirschbaum, and I'm proud to be the director of JCRC's Esther Raab Holocaust Museum and Goodwin Education Center. I'd like to thank Carol, Doug, and Charles for starting us off this evening. We appreciate your messages of support and sharing the importance of Holocaust education and remembering our past. Tonight's evening will be an interactive experience. After Dr. Smith speaks, we'll open it up to questions. We kindly ask that you put all of your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on an iPad, it's at the top of your screen. You can use the chat to share messages only with panelists, and questions in the Q&A will be the only ones that are answered. Throughout the evening, there will be opportunities to donate to further our mission to combat prejudice, bigotry, and hatred, with a link in the chat feature. I'd now like to turn it over to Jonathan Analik, the Rob Goodwin Steering Committee Chair, who will introduce our speaker. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.
Good evening. My name is Jonathan Analik, and I am the chair of the Rob Goodwin Holocaust Museum and Education Center Steering Committee. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Stephen D. Smith. Dr. Smith is the Finci-Viterbi Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation and holds the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Education. Dr. Smith founded the United Kingdom Holocaust Center in Nottinghamshire, England, and co-founded the Aegis Trust for the Prevention of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide. Dr. Smith has served as a producer on a number of film and new media projects, including Dimensions in Testimony and the virtual reality project, The Last Goodbye. In recognition of his work, Dr. Smith has become a member of the Order of the British Empire and received the Interfaith Gold Medallion. He also holds 2 honorary doctorates and lectures widely on issues relating to the history and collective response to the Holocaust, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for everybody for your very, very warm welcome today. You know, I'm very aware, I'm sitting here in Los Angeles, of the amazing work of the New Jersey Holocaust Commission and all of the centers across New Jersey. You do terrific work, and no more so than the Rob Goodwin Center. And especially in this year where we are, you know, up against COVID, the fact that we can't march this year, and the fact that we are together nevertheless, and are together to ensure that we indeed fulfill the mission of the center to ensure that intolerance, bigotry, and hatred does not succeed in our world, and to ensure that the voices of the survivors are heard in order to do that. And I want to thank Charles Middleberg for his very warm welcome and his the direction that he gave us of the importance of testimony to introduce this to the younger generation. For anybody else who's on the call who is a Holocaust survivor, thank you for all that you have done and all that you do to share your story. And for those of you who carry the message of that generation into the future, who are 2nd and 3rd generation, thank you for all that you do. You know, we can only do this if we do it together. And I think your center and the work that you do is a really clear example of how actually when we work together and we march together and we bring our message to our community, how in our various local areas we can do extremely important work with young people. A board member of the Shoah Foundation called me today very excited. The reason he called me was that his sister-in-law's sister, who adopted a young man because she couldn't have children, who was of a Latino background, suddenly during a school project linked to a local Holocaust center, discovered that his mother's sister's brother-in-law had a parent who was in the Shoah Foundation archive. So it's a family relationship, but a very distant one. And for this young man, you know, this is not the history that he'd grown up with. He called me today to say, this young man had spent time listening to his mother's testimony and how deeply touched he was. And then he went on to listen to his father's testimony. And now he wants to look at many more testimonies. And he just said to me, it's so, so important. I'm seeing the transformation in this young 15-year-old who I know at some proximity, transforming as he takes an interest in the world around him because of the testimony that my parents gave. Today, we're going to be exploring some of those testimonies and the importance of sharing them across the world. And in order to do that, I thought we'd start actually close to home. I'd like to invite John back and Jen Analik. It would be great to see you if you can pop your screen back on, and also Renee Ziegel, if you're there. Thank you for all that you do through the center. John and Jen and Renee. It's great to see you here today, and thank you for your very warm welcome. I thought before we got into conversation, though, we should start by listening to a couple of little clips of testimony, which I'm sure you will recognize, but maybe everybody on the call will not have seen. And I'm just going to try and share screen here. And why don't we start actually with Erna Analik, who, interestingly enough, I have seen many times this face because Erna's testimony is used in a number of Shoah Foundation education programs. Let me just play this for just a moment, and then in a second I'll go back to back and I'll play Helen's clip, and then we'll have a little conversation. This is Erna Analik.
I know that I know very little about my parents and my grandparents, and unfortunately there's nobody to ask question of. And I think that maybe when by the time my grandchildren will be interested in knowing what about their ancestry or their grandparents or whatever, there won't be anybody around to ask questions and tell them about it. So I thought, well, maybe if it's recorded and if they're interested, they can find information there. And I think it's good for Jewish people in general to know what happened, that everybody should remember it. Especially here when there are so many people saying that it never happened.
I'll just go and I'll just also share Helen's clip as well. This is Helen Reeder, Renee's mom. Here we go.
Reach out.
Oh, sorry.
Coming to America, I was able to go back to school, to start to be educated again. I was able to reach out somewhere, somehow, what I wasn't accomplishing before. And my biggest accomplishment was my two children. I thought I'd plug with her. My two children. They were always good children, obedient, and they brought pride to us. And they have always been recognized in the community as good people.
Well, that's nice when your mom gives you a plug like that, Renee. That's fantastic. John and Jen, I'm going to start with Jen because I think your grandmother specifically mentioned my grandchildren. And presumably at the time, I think this was probably 1995 or 96 when she did her interview. Do you have any recollection of that?
I have a very vague recollection of it. I was 8. So yeah. And there's a little clip at the very end of the whole testimony where it's clear that I don't really know what was happening. But I remember something very serious was happening in the house. And I mean, now I look back and I've rewatched her testimony so many times, and it's really wonderful and important to have her whole story recorded.
Oh, and when she was then talking about your generation sort of anticipating forward, now that time has come where you are the sort of the generation that holds that memory and is, using that, I guess, through the program that we're doing here. How do you react to her saying that, and what are you doing with her testimony?
Yeah, so I've been doing my best to carry her memory within me all the time. Like, she certainly informed a lot of the decisions that I made and a lot of the values that I hold. So I work in Jewish education with teenagers, not specifically in Holocaust education, but I work for an organization called Moving Traditions, which I create programs for teens around social and emotional topics, and I also lead a fellowship that focuses on social change, so teens creating social change. And I also write poetry, and I've tried my best to capture my grandmother's story within my poetry, and the values that I've taken from her, mostly her resilience, her hardworking nature, and just her she was very, very kind and very selfless.
And John, when you see your mom there, how do you feel when you see her sort of really thinking about the future through her testimony and the importance of memory and ensuring that it's there for the future. How does it make you feel to see her?
You know, it's heartwarming to know that you know, she's going to be there hopefully forever to tell future generations her story, as she tried to do during her life, in spite of it being difficult doing that. This was, when this was taped, it was really the first time that we talked about it in detail. And it turned out that she thought we didn't want to talk about it, and we thought she didn't want to talk about it. We sort of knew the story very vaguely, but it was an amazing opportunity for our family to learn in much more detail what happened, and learn more and more, because little things came back as she talked to different school groups and we talked about it more. She remembered little things, and so it's wonderful that both she and others are going to be able to tell their story for many years to come.
And was it easier for you to talk as a family after that interview had been done? Did she open up and talk more?
She certainly opened up more about it. I think it was difficult, but she definitely opened up. We could talk about it more. It was not a verboten topic to discuss.
Renee, it seems that your mom really had a social conscience that comes through very strongly in the way in which she's talking, and also the fact that you're a good citizen. So I'm really pleased about that. Tell me about her, because it seems to be that was very deeply imbued in the way in which she was telling her own story.
Yes, it was. And it's something that I think she passed on to my brother and I, and then to the next generation, to her grandchildren, who have really embraced being involved in the world in issues of social justice and standing up for human rights. But it was really important to her to teach us not just about, you know, the suffering and the losses that she went through, but to show through example how she was able, with much grace and resilience, move forward and take advantage of opportunities, and encourage us not to squander opportunities, to make something of ourselves, whatever that might be. She certainly had a social conscience, and I'm grateful that these testimonies exist. Her grandchildren have been able to learn from her voice. Students have been able to learn from her. And honestly, when she made these tapes, she let me know. This is going back so many years, I didn't live at home anymore, but she did share her pride that she was able to give voice and let the world know that this happened, that she was able to be a primary source to future generations.
That's great. Well, all of you stick around for a minute, because I'm going to do a little demonstration for those of you who on the event today, just to show you a little bit about the Shoah Foundation archive. Once I find and here we go. And we'll do a little search to see if we can find your family members here, just to give an idea to everybody how it works. So if I just go here and let me put in Erna first. If I put in Erna Anolik, I'm on something here called the Visual History Archive Online, vhaonline.usc.edu. After this webinar is over, anybody can go to this exact page and sign up. So if you're looking for family, or you just want to find testimonies or learn about things about the Holocaust from survivors, you can do that right here. I'm searching under first name, but I could actually search like a Google search for quick search. I'll show you that in a second. So if I go to Erna's interview here, we know that she's there already, so we're cheating a little here. And I hit next. What it's going to do, it's going to bring up Erna's interview. And there she is, the same frame that we saw a little bit earlier. And what you see here is several things. First of all, you see the segments in her testimony. Let's just hop to that. You see the segments in her testimony. In each of those minutes there, you might remember Steven Spielberg initiated the Shoah Foundation in 1994. Initially, 50,000 testimonies of mainly Holocaust survivors, but also other witnesses, other victim types, and including war crimes trial participants and liberators and Roma and Sinti who were victims of the Nazis and so forth. But most of the 50,000 original testimonies were Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. And what we did, we went through every minute of what they said. It's 110,000 hours initially. So that will take about 12 years to watch. And minute by minute, people went through and they put in what the topics were in each minute. You can see it's about Passover here and grandparents. If I click on that, I'm going to get to know about John's grandparents, I guess. No, John's great-grandparents through this segment. If I just click on this, we know now what the topic of this second segment is. You can see she's talking about other family members, and I seem to have stalled it. Oh, crash.
Visit my grandparents because they had a farm and they grew their own vegetables and fruit.
So now we start to get to know a little bit about the family history and what the farm was and so forth. And as we go through, we can scan and see all sorts of different subjects. I can learn a bit more about Erna here, where she was interviewed, by whom, and for how long, and where in Cherry Hill, some basic biographical information. I can also learn about the people in the testimony. So if she talked about John, I'm going to guess that he's here somewhere. There he is, full name, Jonathan, Sunday best name. Oh, where's Jen? There's Jen, look. So actually, one of the nice things about this is you can literally search family names. There are 1.9 million names in this archive. And you can also see here this little diagram of her, oops, that's not a good screen to show you. You can see a diagram of her where she was by looking at that via a map. We can see all the various places that she was. Let's just go and we'll just search for a minute for Helen. We'll do the same thing again. And we'll show you a few other things over here. Get the right name, R-I-E-D-E-R, right? So if I search under Helen Reader here, look, you can see there she is. She's sometimes you put Moishe Cohen and you get like 100 of them, but in this case, there's only one Helen Reader. We see there, oh, one thing I forgot to mention about Erna was how interested I was that she was from Uzhgorod, because I went to Uzhgorod as a teenager when it was still the Soviet Union. But if you want to hear about that, you'll have to ask me to come back because it's a whole hour just telling you about that trip. So here we have Helen's testimony. If I just go here for a second, we're going to hear a little bit about, you can see she starts with her family.
He was a Hasid of the Rebbe.
I'm not sure my speaker's not good there. But what you'll notice here is the subtitles on this. And that's because the Shoah Foundation is starting to work through its testimonies and transcribe them. So at the moment, Erna's has not been transcribed, but apparently Helen's has. About 2,500 of them so far have been, which makes it interesting because now what I can do is I can go to the transcript and I can search in the transcript. So if I just put in Auschwitz, because I know that your mom was in Auschwitz, Renee, then what I can do is search under that, and what it's going to do is bring me back all the times that she talks about that in the testimony. And now what it'll do, it'll jump to one of them, and now we'll be able to hear her talking about those instances. And what you'll see is it'll follow along.
Auschwitz. How long were you in Auschwitz?
I was in Auschwitz for about till September, May, June, July, August, close to 4 months.
So sometimes when you watch these testimonies, for those of us who watch a lot of them, I only just heard very briefly a voice there of the interviewer, which I recognize as being Renee Firestone, who is also a survivor. So Renee lives here in Los Angeles and was one of the first volunteers. So in fact, the archive was not only made up of survivors who told their story, but actually many survivors also interviewed other survivors. And this is an example of that. So as you can see, you can work your way around her testimony in a very interesting way. What we also have here are images. So we can see different photographs of family members, and what we can do actually is ask her to talk about images as well. I think she's going to jump to that. So when I see an image that I'm interested in, I can jump to the image, and it's like a talking album.
This is my brother Yakov Zelikovich and Tova Zelikovich. They live in Israel. They came to my daughter's wedding in 1982.
Where was the wedding?
In Encino, Temple Beth Shalom.
So that's how we can find our way around this. Now, what's also very interesting about this, while I'm here, so some of you may or may not know that we very recently developed a relationship with Ancestry.com to allow people and family members to search there. So if you go to Ancestry.com, always remember, what you have here is a page where records from the Bud Arolson collection and the Shoah Foundation and others are. So if I put in here Helen Reader, I can search this like this. And what now I see is all the places where a Helen Reader, it looks like this is Helene Reader, so it might not be the same person. But as we go down here, what we see is access to the Shoah Foundation, Helen Reader. So when I go to that, what that's going to do now, oh, it's going to ask me to register because I forgot to log in. But anyway, it takes you back to where we started, and in fact, will bring you back to this screen, which is fantastic because what it means is now that family members that are looking that may not know that their grandparent did a testimony in the Shoah Foundation, or maybe looking through, related places or names and so forth, can actually discover that there is a family history there. And in fact, we've had quite a number of people discover that already. So just as we sort of wrap up our conversation, Renee, what is it you think that your mom would most like to see her testimony used for?
I know from her telling me she would want her family, first and foremost, to use the testimony to really remember and embrace their history and their legacy. Excuse that phone ringing. But she would also want to continue teaching. It was so important to her to speak to students, community members, and let them know that this really happened, and she was a witness to it. But most importantly, I think she wanted her family to truly understand what she went through and where we come from.
That's amazing. Yeah, well, listen, I want to share with you that we will, what I always like to hear from family members or from survivors themselves is what their expectations are. And I can share with you that we will certainly be upholding those desires of her at the Shoah Foundation throughout the years. John, your mom, I know from what I see at the Shoah Foundation has already made a contribution to education, but what would you think that she would want us to be doing with her testimony if she had a chance to join us today?
Well, I think that she clearly didn't want people to forget. It was obviously, critical to her that this not be denied, and she, it was hard for her to talk to student groups, but she felt so strongly that that people not bully other people, that people not take advantage of other people. And she really wanted to get that word out there. It was just a critical part of her whole being, was to be anti-bullying and anti-let people have freedoms.
Jen, you're the generation that takes us into the future. Tell me about what you and your peers are doing, either siblings, peers, folks that you know and you're working with. How do you anticipate that you'll work with your generation and take these testimonies to the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our generation is seeing more and more Holocaust survivors not here with us anymore. So we're relying on the third and now fourth generations to keep telling the stories. And I think retelling the stories, living the stories in a lot of ways, living the values that my grandmother passed on, and that all survivors passed on. I think continuing also to, I know a lot of my peers are very passionate about social change and about fighting discrimination in all of its forms, and that's one large way that we're carrying forward my grandmother's legacy and many other survivors' legacies.
I just want to say to the three of you and to all the other families that are on today that when Steven Spielberg started the Shoah Foundation, he made two promises to the survivors. The first is that the testimonies will be preserved in perpetuity. Turns out that perpetuity is a really long time. So we have a commitment through the Shoah Foundation to preserve the testimonies and to keep them protected for all time, for generations and generations and generations to come. Secondly, you made a promise that the testimonies would be used for education. And through our partnerships with organizations like your own and through the work that we do with organizations all around the world, we're here to help you to make sure that promise is kept. We're keeping it by working with you. If you can keep it by sharing the testimony, then we're actually keeping our promise to their whole generation. And thank you for all you do. And we'll move on with the program at this point, but thank you. Okay, you'll see the Q&A is going, folks. Please do put your Q&A together. I see that Robin Sue's asking, what is Reish Hey Ayin behind me? Well, actually, that painting is one that my wife had. It's one of the 72 names of God, and it means turning difficult situations into opportunities and blessings. And boy, have the Holocaust survivors demonstrated that over the generations. Norman's asking about Facebook, and I'll just share with you that I was involved in some of the discussion that was going back and forward about a year ago with Mark Zuckerberg. It was pretty disappointing at the time. This is a very good step forward. I will be writing about this week. I think it's also a very complicated step. Of course, a private company can decide exactly what it wants to publish and not, and I'm glad to say they won't be publishing any more Holocaust denial material. So thank you for Facebook for finally coming around on what was obvious a long time ago. I would also say I want to know exactly what those policies are and how they get put into place, because it's really, really tricky stuff, Holocaust denial, and it's not a bunch of neo-Nazis going around with a Heil Hitler and saying the Jews weren't murdered. In fact, there's some very, very sophisticated denial that actually is going to be extremely difficult to expunge from the platform, and those policies are going to be pretty critical if that's going to happen, because most denial is not confrontational denial anymore. It's very insipid. It finds its way into all kinds of different media. And so there's a challenge ahead, but it's good they've made the decision. It's really great. I'm going to move on for a little while to show you a few things and update you on the Shoah Foundation so that you can see a little of what's going on and tell you some of the latest things. And I'll keep watching the questions because I know you have many questions as we go. So let's just move. Yes, here we go. So in fact, here we go. We just talked about who was interviewing Helen. It was this very lady here, Renee Firestone. And you can see she's in a classroom there in Los Angeles working together. Jeff Shackett's asking how many survivors are out there whose testimony has not yet been recorded. Great question, Jeff. Actually, many survivors have left it very late because they weren't really ready 25 years ago. We've got a list of about 400. We have a program called the Last Chance Testimony Program, and we've interviewed 3 this week. We're trying to move it as fast as we can. There is a race against time, and it's been made much more complicated because of COVID. But we are doing social distanced interviews where we send camera kits to people's homes and interview them over Zoom. And we're getting actually very, very good results. But it's just taking a little bit of time to work that out. So if I just see if I can move my, there we go. Some of you might have seen a little while ago, the Claims Conference made some announcements about a survey that it had done, showing that very large numbers, in fact, almost 50% of millennials couldn't name a single camp or ghetto, and stunning results in terms of, stunningly bad results in terms of level of education. Same time that came out, another survey came out that was published by Echoes and Reflections, which is a Holocaust education program that you might be familiar with, and many schools do across New Jersey do use it in conjunction with the New Jersey Holocaust Commission and many of the centers. Actually, this is a Shoah Foundation ADL Yad Vashem joint program, and although I wasn't involved in the actual structure of the survey, one thing that came out of this was not so much what do young people know, but what do they do with what they know? The surveys showed something quite similar, and that was that actually young people, about 80% of them, even if they can't name a camp or a ghetto, do know that the Holocaust happened. And in fact, the surveys were very close on both of those. In the Echoes and Reflections survey, we found that 80% of the college undergraduates that were surveyed actually had some form of Holocaust education. So once again, thank you, New Jersey Holocaust Commission and the other commissions around the country. 80% is really good penetration of any market for anything. So actually, it's starting to work. It doesn't mean to say that they get necessarily good Holocaust education. And it seems to be that the knowledge isn't sticking. But what we did find is among those who could say that they did have Holocaust education, look at these figures. 28% more likely to challenge incorrect or biased information. 12% more likely to challenge intolerant behavior in others. 20% more likely to stand up to negative stereotypes. 50% less likely to do nothing in a bullying scenario. So what we're interested in is not so much what do they know, but what do they learn from their Holocaust education? Your particular mission to overcome intolerance and prejudice and hatred, bigotry and hatred, really plays to this. It shows that we can't take for granted that teaching about the Holocaust is going to result in this, but the signs are very good and we want to strengthen the things that are working. And so the other thing that we found was that students that used testimony had an even better chance of being positive citizens in these particular scenarios that we tested. So if you want to have a look at that, you can just Google my name, Stephen Smith, and the forward. You'll find there's an article in there which I explore that, and you can just also find, in fact, we'll put the URLs for these two surveys in the chat so you can take a look at them sometime. So I showed you the Visual History Archive. That is the basis of everything we do. You can see there are 54,000 testimonies available. What you'll also notice, though, oh, I'm not live here, is that if I scroll this down, sorry, this is a screenshot. If I scroll it down, you're going to see also testimonies from Rwanda and Armenia and Cambodia and the Rohingya. And that's because the Shoah Foundation has started to collect testimonies in a variety of different places. I'm going to just stop share because my screen is doing something funny. And then we'll try again. Since over the last 10 years, we've been collecting testimony from a whole variety of different places. And wonderful thing about technology, I'm involved in technology with the Shoah Foundation. And one of the things I've learned about it is it's terrific because sometimes it works. And right now, this is not working. So I'm going to go to plan B, which is fine, which is I'm going to go through this PowerPoint and look at it and tell you what I'm looking at. What's been happening at the Shoah Foundation, we have decided that we wanted to bring to the attention of the wider world the importance of understanding genocide in all its various forms. We don't compare genocide because human suffering cannot be compared, but we do compare the causes and the consequences because we want to know, deeply want to know, how does this happen and what does it mean? One of the things that we've learned is that young people really do want to ask those kind of questions. This evening, I'm going to share with you a particular program that we've been working on called Dimensions in Testimony. Some of you may have seen this at the Richard Stockton College, which I think is pretty close to where most of you live, where earlier this year, prior to the COVID pandemic, we introduced Dimensions in Testimony to New Jersey through the Richard Stockton College. Obviously, that ground to a halt, but we are developing an online version of this. I'm going to share it with you right now so that you can see where we're going with bringing testimony to classrooms in an interactive way. Now, the way in which we went about this is that we developed a method of interviewing Holocaust survivors differently from the way in which they'd been interviewed traditionally. Traditionally, we sit in a room and we talk to them about their life and what happened next. And we build this life history up. And we do hear these sort of wonderful opinions and thoughts like we heard from Erna and Helen. But to get to the questions that students ask, you have to search in the index and you have to find it. So one of our questions was, before the Holocaust survivors are no longer with us, is it possible to sit down and ask all of those questions that students ask and be prepared for the future so that when the Holocaust survivors are no longer at our programs, that the students can still ask their questions? One of the things that I noticed was that students were not listening to a Holocaust survivor and then afterwards saying, sir or miss, thank you so much for sharing your story. Could you just qualify, was it the 13th or 14th of May that you were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto? They were asking questions like, can you forgive the perpetrators? What was it like to lose your mother? Do you miss your sister? Do you hate the perpetrators? And questions that were really about the human consequences of the Holocaust. And really what we saw there is they're just trying to learn, what does this mean? And so we asked those questions. We also did ask the qualifying questions. What day did you leave the Warsaw Ghetto? Because we wanted to make sure that we had the historical questions too. But what I thought I would do in lieu of my PowerPoint right now is just have a little quick conversation with Pinchas Gutter here online, who's been recorded for about 5 days and answered over 1,000 questions about his life. And then if you want to put any questions that you might have into the Q&A, you can just put Pinchas in front of it, and then I will ask him what the things that you might be asking. Although I see I can't open the Q&A at the same time as the screen, so we'll have to think about that. Okay. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
What is your name?
My name is Pinchas Gutter.
Where were you born?
I was born in Łódź, in Poland.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had a twin sister. That's the only sibling I had.
What happened to your sister?
My family were murdered in Majdanek. My father, my mother and sister were murdered on the same day when we arrived to the camp from Warsaw.
And what was it like in Majdanek?
In the morning, as soon as we were woken up and it was daylight, we were chased. We had a little bit of time to do our ablutions. You know, we went to a block where there were, you know, holes in what do you call it, where you had to go and do your business as quickly as possible, and you had to wash yourself quickly, and then the couples were chasing you and rushing and here and there, and then you had to go and stand on the parade plus on a parade, and each, if I remember correctly, each barrack stood separately. And then each blockälteste would count. And if there was somebody died at night or was killed at night, they would put them next to you, next to the. And then they would count. And they would count, and then everybody was counting. And then there was an assessment who stood away, and they would all go up to the assessment and tell him the numbers, and he would tally the numbers. And if there was something wrong with the numbers, they had to count again. And they would count again and count again and count again until they got the numbers wrong. And if they couldn't get the numbers wrong, we would stand there until such time as the numbers were to their satisfaction.
So you can see Pinchas goes into quite some detail. I just stopped him there for a second. Because he spends time spending the whole day. There's the sort of the quick questions that he might have, but there's also the detailed ones. Hi, Jen.
Hi, we have one question in the chat for Pinchas.
Oh, great. What's that?
The question is, how old were you when you were in Majdanek?
I was going on 11.
As you can see, actually, I just triggered the microphone then while you were talking, and it heard it over Zoom, which is fantastic.
Wow.
So he was 11 years old. So after you imagine, what was it like being a child in the Warsaw Ghetto?
In the beginning, when I was capturing these images, a lot of these, especially in the Warsaw Ghetto, when I started seeing young children dying of hunger, I couldn't understand it really, why they were, and I couldn't cope with their suffering. In other words, I was hurting. I could feel the hurt inside me, almost like if I was part of them. I felt they hurt.
So what you see there is, I'd never asked him that question before, But when I heard that he was 11 years old, it triggered for me the question, so what was it like to be, because he arrived in Majdanek at 11, that means he must have been in the Warsaw Ghetto before that. So what he talks about there is, you know, the feelings and the of being a child in the ghetto at the time. So I'm not saying that Pinchas would not have said that in his testimony, but I never saw that in the 3 testimonies he did for different organizations. So this longer interview allows him a bit more time. His other interviews are about 2.5 hours in length. This is a 20-hour interview. So there's 10 times the amount of content in this interview than others. So we think of this not as an interactive gizmo that allows you to have an interesting conversation, but actually as a really long testimony that allows you to get deeply into subjects. And Jen's back.
Yes, I'm back with 2 more questions. The first is from Nate. Nate asks, Pinchas, what was life like after the war?
See if he caught that.
I started off by living in Czechoslovakia for several months. I was then in England. From England, I went to France. From France, I went to Israel. From Israel, I went back to England. From England, then I went to South America, to Brazil. From Brazil, I went to South Africa. And finally, from South Africa, I went to Toronto, where I live now.
So before you do the next one, Jen, I'll just share with you, there could be different ways of coming at this. So he just gave you a list of where he went in answer to your question, Nate. But we could say to him, how were you treated as a Holocaust survivor?
They were welcome on the one hand, and they were unwelcome on the other hand. They were welcome as people that came to serve in the army, because a lot of Holocaust survivors came immediately when Israel was attacked in 1948, and they immediately went to fight, and for that they were okay. But they weren't welcomed as, they were called that they were like sheep when going to the slaughter. In other words, they weren't very brave people, which was complete nonsense. And whenever I hear today anybody saying that, it actually engenders in me anger, which is not something that easily does.
So when I asked about how was he accepted, he went to his experience in Israel. But maybe I would ask him a question about what were conditions like immediately after the war?
Well, there's a very interesting story that I can tell you about the Day of Liberation, how I started. When we woke up on the 8th, actually on the 8th of May, the last day of the war, when we woke up, we found that the gates were open. The Czech gendarmes and the SS have disappeared, and we could just go out. And I was healthy enough to be able to run out and see what was going on. And
I'm going to stop him there. It's a long story, but he describes the Day of Liberation in some detail. So what you can do, Nate, is get very granular about your question, which is like taking a step at a time. What happened immediately after? We heard that he went to Brazil. Why did you go to Brazil? We saw that he was in England. What happened in England? And so actually you can build up a very full picture, starting from that initial question that you asked, which got us, I was here, 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 and here. And just like in any other conversation that you would have with a human being, you go, oh, really? So you went to Brazil? Why? And then you can start to learn more about that. Jen.
Amazing. So we have 2 more questions. One of them is, Pinchas, tell us why students should care about studying the Holocaust more than 75 years later.
Sorry, I think you missed that. Pinchas, why should people care about studying the Holocaust 75 years later?
I believe in providence, but there was a selection for people.
You missed that. So this is, but the reason I actually always also, Jen, this is a little bit of inside baseball for people, always try to get the question verbatim, is that we don't know exactly how people are going to form their sentences. And so artificial intelligence takes time to train and learn. And so who asked that question? I forgot the person's name.
Oh, this was an anonymous attendee.
Oh, I don't know. So I specifically tried to rephrase it as you phrased it, because it helps the AI to learn what people are thinking about when they say things. I'll just paraphrase it. Why should people learn about the Holocaust?
I think Holocaust education is important because it shows a face of humanity, of that inhuman aspect of what humanity can get up to, so that people can actually be confronted with a reality that they most probably don't think is possible. And to see that that thing is possible, and if you are, it's almost like a vaccination. You know, you vaccinate so you shouldn't get the disease. And I think that by showing people what can happen, hopefully they will strive for it not to happen and eradicate it.
I recorded that 3 years before the pandemic, so you're obviously thinking ahead.
We have one more question, which I think will be pretty straightforward and easy to answer. So this is from Marvin Raab. Were you from a religious family?
Was my family religious? My family were very religious. We were strictly Orthodox, and we tried to live as much an Orthodox life in the Warsaw Ghetto, because right from the beginning, the Nazis forbade, they closed all the schools, not only religious schools, so there was no schooling. They closed synagogues, so you couldn't go to pray. You weren't allowed to pray in public. But there was immediate resistance to all these laws. And my father found a teacher, and I went to study the holy books and spiritual books, Jewish, the Talmud and the Old Testament. And people started creating underground universities, and there was continuous resistance to the laws of what the Nazis did not allow you to do. So we tried to live as much as possible a religious life in the Warsaw Ghetto.
So we've got to follow that one up. Do you believe in God today?
I believe in God, yes, I do. I believe in a being that watches over us all the time. I don't know which way and how and what, and I don't speculate on it. It's just something which is inherent in me. It's part of me. It's part of my sinuous part of my whole, system. My cultural, my morals, everything is something, is part of my Chassidut, and Chassidut means believe in the Almighty.
But we could also rephrase that, and we could say, how can you possibly believe in God after your experience?
How can you possibly not believe in God? I mean, to survive such an apocalyptic inferno as the Holocaust, I mean, there's only one way. You either believe in chance or you believe in providence. And as far as I'm concerned, I believe in providence.
Well, we could actually go on talking to him all evening, literally, and more besides that. But thank you for asking your questions, everybody. I know that Pinchas will be very pleased that you did so. He's still alive and well, living in Toronto. And in fact, he's a chazan in synagogue in Toronto, the Kiev Shul. And I went to my first ever virtual Kol Nidre service, which they held like 2 hours before sundown on Erev Yom Kippur. And Pinchas has done the Kol Nidre service for 27 years in that synagogue, and this was the first year he was going to miss. So they decided to hold it a couple of hours early and do it on Zoom, and it was quite moving to be there with him. So I don't know if anyone's else got any questions. We just ran a little bit over time because obviously it took a little while to get everybody in today. And I'm just going to end as we're looking at the Q&A, if anybody doesn't have anything to say, just a few things about the future.
Questions, but
oh, please, let's take them. Let's take them.
Yeah. So one question is from Norman, and his question is, what do you think about Facebook finally changing its policy about allowing Holocaust denial comments?
Yes, I think I touched on this one a little earlier, Jen, and I think that it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. It should have happened a long time ago. I think now it's just going to be a huge job to not only monitor that, it's just not black and white. It really is not. And it's going to be extremely difficult for Facebook to put policies in place, I believe, that are going to be easy to moderate. I do worry that it will send Holocaust deniers underground. I do worry that it will send them to other channels. It's good they're not on Facebook, but it won't change their beliefs. But obviously taking the oxygen away is a very good thing. I think we'll just find that our challenge pops up somewhere else, because I'm afraid to say this is going to be whack-a-mole for some time, and the internet is not all Facebook. But these giant media corporations like Facebook, it's the right thing to do. The more of them that get courageous and do this and think of themselves more as media channels and not just free open sources of everything that anybody can post anywhere for any reason, and actually help to make that content safe for everybody, I think is the right thing to do. And also, to point to sources of information that the public can learn from. And I'm glad that they're doing that. It's really good.
Thank you. And then the last question is, how many survivors are still out there whose testimony has not yet been recorded?
And also, as you see popping up, how do survivors who want to be recorded get on the list? All right, so first thing is going to be straightforward. We're going to put an email address in the chat in a second, so you can find the right person at the Shoah Foundation to let people know where they can be recorded. We're working our way as quickly as we can through our list. It's a little slow going with the COVID, but we're trying our best, and we'll certainly reach out and be in touch as soon as we can. It's interesting, there are several 100,000 survivors still alive. Surprising, but there is a reason for it, actually. Well, three reasons I put it down to. The first is, obviously, many of the survivors of the Holocaust were teenagers and in their early 20s, because many Jews just didn't survive when they were older than that very easily, and the vast majority were in their teens and early 20s. Which means if you were 15 in 1945, you're 90 today. And just with longevity improving throughout the last, 3/4 of a century, we are seeing, everybody's living longer. And then I'm going to add a little overrider to that. And I don't have any data, so please don't quote me on this. But these folks just seem to be tough as old boots. They survived the Holocaust, and they seem to have this drive for life and are living remarkably long lives and fruitful lives. And we're so grateful for all that the Holocaust survivors have done and continue to do to support the work of organizations like your own and like ours. We simply cannot do it without you, those of you who are on the call, and without them, those who are not. And we owe a very, very big debt of gratitude. And I think both of these questions are pointing towards the fact is we need to take this time that we have left, because both of your families that were on this evening know that that time comes to an end eventually, and how precious it is while we have it. We must treat this time with great preciousness, capture these stories, make sure that we take not only their life histories, but the lessons of their lives and the lives they have lived, and the way in which they have guided us into our future. And I think if we are going to counter hate in our world, it's not just the fact that they survived the Holocaust, it's how they lived the life and the lessons that they lived through the lives that they lived. And well, I will keep that story going.
Wonderful. And I know we have a couple of questions that haven't been answered, but we'll be able to give answers after this call. But I have been asked to ask you quickly how we're preserving testimonies.
So testimonies are preserved. So everybody thinks that digitization is preservation. Like, I put my things in the cloud, so therefore it's safe. Not true. Digital medium is extremely vulnerable medium. And if you've got everything in the cloud, then make sure you got a copy that's not in the cloud. or if you've got a cloud account, make sure you've got more than one. And remember that there's no such thing as the cloud. It's machines that live in a company's building. So if you are very confident that that company and that building and that infrastructure has got your back, then great. But also when you put your media, your content onto media, the newer the medium, the faster it rots. So if I filmed somebody 50 years ago on 16mm film and put it in a storage case, it'll be absolutely pristine right now. When I transferred my photographs to my zip drive 3 years ago, that's in a worse condition already than the film that was done 50 years ago, because digital medium is not stable. So what we do at the Shoah Foundation is we split our testimonies into 4. We have 2 in California, 1 in South Carolina, 1 in Prague. They're disaggregated from each other, which means you can't get into any of them when you're in one or the other, so they can't be hacked, or all 4 can't be hacked at the same time. We check every single testimony every single 3 months. If we lose 1 0 or 1 1 from any given file, we replace it and we update it. So the testimonies are exactly the same as when we digitized them about 15 years ago. That continues every 3 months for 3 years. And at 3 years old, we discard the media and we replace it with new media. So you imagine doing that for 55,000 testimonies. It's a very, I'll just tell you how much data we have. I was on the phone to the library in Israel, the National Library in Israel the other day. We were talking about perhaps putting the Shoah Foundation collection as one of our backups in Israel. And I said to them, how much data do you have, the National Library of Israel, on your backup system? And they have 1.7 petabytes. 1,000 terabytes is 1 petabyte. So it's 1,700 terabytes. The Shoah Foundation's archive, which would just be one collection within that, is 6 petabytes. We have more than 3 times more data than the entire library in Israel. And the reason for that is the Shoah Foundation's archive is all video, and it's very high definition video. And so what we're trying to do is a really big job and keeping it there. And we made the promise we were going to preserve them. And so we're keeping that promise that way.
Thank you. Well, we're very grateful that you're preserving them, and I know if we were in a large room, everybody would be applauding right now. So hold your applause.
Please do visit the USC Shoah Foundation website. Also look at the school's site called Eyewitness. I'm sure your team are familiar with that. It's where we use testimonies for education. And of course, when Dimensions and Testimony becomes available, as we saw just now with Pinchas, we'll look forward to sharing that with you so that you can continue your conversation with Pinchas and 25 other Holocaust survivors sometime in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. And I'm going to pass it on to Allison Snyder, who is the co-chair of the March of Remembrance Committee.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Jen. And thank you all for choosing to be with us for tonight's 8th annual March of Remembrance program. I am Allison Snyder, co-chair of the March of Remembrance Committee. And I want to quickly thank a few people before we close, especially to my co-chair, Carol Orwitz. What a pleasure it has been working with you this year on what I know has always been a special passion project of yours. Thank you to Dr. Stephen Smith for sharing with us some of the trends and the technological advances of Holocaust education. Everyone who joined us tonight knows to combat anti-Semitism and hatred, we must continue to educate ourselves and others through these important lessons. Having the opportunity to see the recordings of family from our own March of Remembrance Committee members, Jen, John, and Renee, and hearing their own thoughts and feelings was so special. And thank you all. It was being able to meet with Pinchas was such a treat. I know I personally look forward to visiting with other survivors at the Shoah Foundation and encourage you all to do the same. In addition, I also encourage you to take advantage of the many resources we have at our very own JCRC's Esther Raab Holocaust Museum and Goodwin Education Center. I'm sure many of you were inspired by the words of Dr. Smith and will want to share tonight's presentation with others. Don't worry, we will be sending you a link to the recorded version. To our many sponsors and donors, we are deeply grateful for your generosity. Your donations support our mission to teach people about the past and to educate them for the future through the painful lessons of the Holocaust. Our objective is to reduce prejudice and lessen hatred, bigotry, bullying, and violence against all groups. We cannot continue to do all we do without your support. For those who have not had a chance to support our largest fundraiser of the year, it is not too late. There's currently a link in our chat, and we will make sure you receive a link in our follow-up communication, or simply visit our website, robgoodwin.org, at any time. As Carol shared in the beginning of our program, your donations allow us to continue offering a wide variety of programs to thousands of students, educators, and community members. And as Dr. Smith previously shared, there was some promising, albeit a bit overdue, news coming out of Silicon Valley just today with Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook. It is a bit disheartening that some of the reasons given by Mr. Zuckerberg and other executives for this policy change is the data showing an increase in anti-Semitic violence and hate speech in our country and globally, along with an alarming level of ignorance about the Holocaust, especially among young people. This only reinforces why we all must continue to fund the Rob Goodwin Center so that we can continue to educate future generations to fight similar battles until anti-Semitism is only a word mentioned in our history books. But before we end, I just must thank our dedicated March of Remembrance committee this year, who worked hard to bring this program to fruition. You were thoughtful during a challenging year to be creative. Your ideas and passions really made it come to life. And of course, all of us cannot send enough appreciation to our director, Helen Kirschbaum, and Israel and Holocaust Education Fellow, Aaron Sauer, without whom none of this would happen today and every day at Rob Goodwin. So finally, thank you to our precious community survivors. As Carol shared earlier, you inspire us to make this a better world. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.